Now, as delegates leave the Scottish Greens conference in Perth this afternoon, they'll surely be musing on the party's strategy for the months ahead while supporting the SNP's key objective of independence. They've also committed to finding new ways to wring concessions from the Scottish Government. Glenn Cooksley reports.
Relatively small in number, they have 6 MSPs, the Scottish Greens aren't strangers to fighting for causes close to their hearts. They made a stand over council tax and fracking, and then there's the Scottish Government's backing of a third runway at Heathrow and a cut in air passenger duty. Moves which Patrick Harvie described as unthinkable. With the Scottish Greens the only opposition party in favour of independence, their support's vital for the minority Scottish Government's ultimate objective, which should put them in a strong position to win concessions.
We'd like to see the SNP standing their ground on being progressive, as they claimed to be, to get in previous governments. They've said some good words and they've done a few good things, but there's a few areas that we need to keep holding their feet to the fire on, and that's what we're going to do.
There are lots of other policies that will be just trying to nudge the SNP in the right direction, in the progressive direction, away from sort of just looking after big business, which obviously is a tendency for them.
Could the Green Party support in Parliament be conditional?
I think, well, personally, I would put it that way. Whether that's going to be the party policy, I can't really comment. I'm not involved in party policy, but from a personal perspective, I would say would need to be conditions.
And Patrick Harvie's conference message to the SNP: commit to meaningful progressive changes and you'll get our support. Fail to commit and you risk being remembered as a timid government.
Well, I'm joined now from outside his party's conference in Perth by the Scottish Greens co-convener Patrick Harvie. I was going to say, Patrick Harvie, how blessed you are being in the fair city, but it does actually appear to be raining.
Well, we've had mixed weather in Perth, to be fair, but there's been a very good atmosphere inside the conference, not only as we celebrate the election of our additional MSPs in the most recent Holyrood election, but prepare as well for the local elections next year, where we'll be fielding by far the biggest number of candidates ever, and with the capacity that we've grown across the country to get out there and campaign on a scale that's been lacking in the past. So we're really optimistic about the achievement of getting more councillors elected right across Scotland.
Can I get your view immediately on something Gordon Wilson, I hope you could hear him, was talking about there, where he's keen on the idea of separating a campaign for independence from the SNP running the Scottish Government. And he talked about perhaps having, even if it's just initially a think tank, some sort of thing that's independent of the SNP, which would involve people like yourselves. Presumably, you would welcome that.
Well, I would welcome that kind of development. I think one of the challenges to get over in that is how you would ensure that the multiple arguments, the many cases on independence would be heard within that, rather than just one dominant voice. That was one of the problems of the 2014 Yes Scotland campaign. I think we've said that openly in the past. I think the diversity of arguments about what an independent Scotland could be like is one of the strengths in a democratic system. We should be celebrating diversity of arguments as a strength in our culture, not regarding it as a weakness. There are different arguments to be made about what kind of policies or directions or economic future the idea of an independent Scotland could encompass. Just look at the question of oil and gas. We've been arguing consistently that investment in a sustainable long-term economy that can provide jobs that will last for the long term is a really urgent priority, instead of just pretending that fields coming to the end of their lives will somehow last forever. It's not realistic.
Now, with your extra MSPs, which you were very quick to mention, the Scottish Greens have an incredibly powerful position in this Parliament. You've been talking at your conference about how your support for the SNP's budget would be conditional on various things like fracking and air passenger duty. But that's not the real power you have. The real power you have is they can't have another independence referendum unless you back them.
I think it would be quite wrong for any political party to use the fact of minority government simply to start playing games like that. I'm not going to trade off our support for a policy that we agree with in exchange for completely separate issues. I think the case needs to be strengthened for independence, and I would agree with Gordon Wilson to that point. Not necessarily sure I would agree with on all of the arguments that he might want to put, but the case needs to be strengthened. Fundamentally, this is a conflict, though, between two referendum results. I understand and fully
hang on.
respect
Let's
that
come
not
on to that
everyone who voted Remain.
Let's come on to that in a moment.
Okay.
But the real power you have is you can say to the SNP government, if you abolish air passenger duty, we won't vote for a second referendum. If you don't ban fracking, we won't vote for a second referendum. Now, I've always understood from you and from other people in the Greens that independence for you is more a tactical thing. It's not your be-all and end-all obsession. It's just a way of you getting the kind of green policies you want. So why subordinate the green policies you want and turn independence into some sort of principle?
The idea of Scotland becoming independent is absolutely a means to an end, a means of achieving the fairer Scotland that we would be more able to deliver with the powers of independence. It's not a bargaining chip. It's not a bargaining chip to be pushed across the table in exchange for separate issues, because I think that would be an entirely unethical way to do politics. You know, we will argue the case on fracking as we have done, and we've succeeded in pushing the Scottish Government, first of all, to add underground coal gasification to that moratorium, and then to ban it altogether. I'm very confident that working alongside all those who support a ban on fracking, we will achieve that. I think actually the Tories piping up and saying how brilliant fracking would be helps make our case for that.
But why would you block their...
On the budget, we're going to argue for progressive taxation and make sure that we can protect the public services that we need to value in Scotland.
Why would you block their budget but not block their referendum? After all, it's on their referendum that you have the power. Unless they give in to what you want, they simply can't have it. You've got immense leverage when it comes to the referendum. They'll find other people in other parties to support them on their budget, but only you can deliver their referendum.
Well, I think it remains to be seen whether they'll find other support on the budget, and the new Finance Secretary is going to have to give some ground from the SNP's manifesto position if he wants to persuade others to support the budget. But no, the idea that we would drop a policy that we support, the idea of supporting independence or of putting that to the electorate on the basis of a grubby deal about other issues, I don't think that would be principled at all. Look, we've got a conflict between the way Scotland voted in 2014 and 2016. I know and respect that not everyone who voted Remain this year will suddenly want to switch and support independence, but similarly, we also have to respect the fact that not everyone who voted No in 2014 is willing to see Scotland dragged out of Europe against our will, surrendering rights, having rights taken away from people that we did not vote to surrender. 62% of us voted to Remain, and that mandate is being utterly disregarded by the UK government. And I think the case is strong that the people of Scotland need at least the possibility of having that question put to them so that they can resolve that conflict in the only way that is legitimate, a democratic process, a vote of all the people, including the people who were denied a vote in this year's EU referendum, like 16 and 17-year-olds and EU nationals whose lives are now in such turmoil as a result of that.
Isn't your argument there, from a democratic point of view, a bit iffy to say that somehow or other a pretty clear referendum vote that was made 2 years ago is now cast into doubt? I mean, it's also a bit patronising to the people of Scotland. I mean, many people who voted no will say, look, I'm sorry, Mr Harvie, we understood perfectly well what we voted for. We want to be part of the United Kingdom. And for you to start claiming that somehow we didn't know what we were doing, therefore we have to vote again, sorry, we're not having it.
I don't claim for a moment that people didn't know what they were doing. We had a long and engaging debate in the long run up to that campaign. But the reality is, if you voted no and then you voted Remain, you're not going to get what you want. So we have to resolve this fundamental conflict. And yes, there would be many people who voted no who are willing to leave the European Union, but there are also people who voted no who believed Better Together when they said that voting yes would put our future in Europe at risk and voting no would safeguard it. Well, that was a piece of nonsense, just as much as many of the lies of the Leave campaign this year were shown to be utterly spurious nonsense. And so there is a real conflict, a fundamental conflict between the results of the way people in Scotland voted in these two referendums.
Well, your argument there might have some credibility had there been a big upsurge in the polls in favour of either having a second referendum or voting for independence, but there hasn't been. So, of course, a lot of people in Scotland will say, well, thank you very much, Mr Harvie, for sympathising with our alleged democratic deficit, but you're just making this up.
Well,
we're not interested.
What the polls are showing is that I think what the polls are showing is that there has been movement in both directions. And it may be that the overall number in the polls has only gone up a little, but there has been movement in both directions. And that is before we see the real consequences of the hard Brexit that seems to be the new intention. You know, the UK government taking a 52% result across the UK and turning that into a mandate for a hard Brexit, taking us out not only of the European Union itself, but also out of the single market, with all of the economic consequences that will have for people's jobs, for people's incomes, for whole industries. You know, we've just been speaking to some of the higher education sector in Scotland here at the conference, who are deeply concerned not only about the level of interest from EU students coming to study here, but their ability to cooperate and collaborate with other higher education institutions in terms of research grants and funding. Scotland's made a fantastic contribution to a lot of those kind of projects. That's the kind of thing that's being put at risk. And as people start to see the consequences of that hard Brexit that Liam Fox, Boris Johnson and others who have no regard at all for the way Scotland voted, that's what they're aiming for, and I think people in Scotland will reject that.
Very briefly, to come back to the beginning of this conversation, there seems to be an acceptance, including within the SNP, that some aspects of the prospectus for independence, particularly the currency, were not really convincing enough. And of course, we've also had the collapse in oil prices and the possibility of a large deficit in an independent Scotland. Everyone keeps saying these issues have got to be addressed, but the problem seems to be they're not, as a matter of fact, being addressed, are they? We're not getting any answers on that.
Well, the Scottish Greens, I think, are the only party who've made any credible effort to suggest an alternative economic path for Scotland that ends our reliance on fossil fuels, but invests in economies and industries that will create the jobs that communities, particularly those most reliant to fossil fuels, they need to see a positive future rather than, as with previous waves of deindustrialisation, people just being left on the economic scrap heap. We're also trying to do work, and we'll continue that during this year, on the alternatives of currency. But the idea of a currency union with a non-EU member state, if we were to become independent and seek to be a full EU member, I think that's even more problematic than it was in 2014. So I'm glad that there's some willingness to start finally looking at laying the groundwork for the other options that need to be made credible, need to be made realistic options for Scotland.
All right, Patrick Harvie, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. I'm sure the sun is about to come out.
Thank you.